leadership. Because as a leader, it can be a bit of a lonely place and it is a difficult job. So having this space and this time is really valuable. You might want a pen and paper to just, or an electronic form of that. So, but just some space to reflect because I might be sharing things with you that might get you thinking. And particularly that's what I want to do. I want to get you thinking about maybe what you do, maybe what comes naturally, and maybe what doesn't come naturally to you. I work very much in the space of soft skills, and I find that this is often is easier to be learning softer skills when we allow that time and space to reflect. So just a little bit about me. So I'm a psychology graduate, and I failed psychologist. I retrained in public relations and communications. And I've worked mostly internationally. I'm British, lived in the Netherlands for about 18 years now. And mostly I work with in the STEM area, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And I spent 13 years in the oil and gas industry, working in communications and then in internal communications. And I moved into like teaching and coaching on soft skills. And that led me to set up my business, which is called Humanly. Here's some of the people I've worked with, some of the organizations I've worked with. And what I do is a lot of these sort of sessions, which is helping to train and coach leaders and teams in leadership skills, but also communication skills. I help to support when there's more demand for human-centered change. We do a lot of change, but when we really need to think about people, that's the kind of work I also pick up. A lot of team effectiveness, people coming back together as teams, especially after COVID, things changed, and we really need to focus on the effectiveness of the teams. And I also do one-on-one coaching. So, and feel free to just get in touch with me. I tend to be on LinkedIn, but also I will share my website after the session. So here's what I plan to cover in the session, roughly around 30 minutes per topic. I'm, as you can tell, a bit of an advocate for human leadership and improving the way that you lead. So I will start with sort of where I start everywhere, anytime I'm working with leaders, is starting on building up your self-awareness, understanding what is your role when it comes to leading a team. What does that require? And how do you think about that? Then we'll move into focusing on people and how we build the team that we want. So maybe some of you have a team, maybe it's a small team, maybe it's a growing team, or you have a team that's already established. So it's thinking about how you build up that team and what are the elements that you need and the factors that you need when you're forming a team and growing. Because how your team functions is really the soul of how your organization can grow. And that leads into this sort of run and maintain. And this is really being intentional about the culture that you have and the one you want to build. Whether you intentionally build a culture, you have one. And it's about becoming a bit more aware about what the culture is that you have and being intentional about where you go. And I'm happy to pause at points to take any questions that you have. So please feel free to use that Q&A box, use the raising of your hand, and let me know. Hopefully, if I don't spot it, Smitesh or someone will give me a nudge and let me know there's something there. I'm happy to pause as we go. So yeah, let's start by just thinking about your job and how you are leading. So this might be a good time to kind of have your pen and paper and a bit of reflection time. And I want you to just have a think about what is the hardest thing about leading, and particularly in leading your team. And you can use the Q&A in this space. What is the hardest thing about leading your team? So it's important to take this time to think about the things that you find easier and the things that you find hard. You will need to pay more attention to those things that you find hard, because they may be getting in the way of your success. So keep everybody inspired and motivated. Yeah. And Sergio, that's a really good comment to see there. And often what I see in leaders is that a feeling of like responsibility to be the sole source of the inspiration and motivation in the team. What we'd ideally like to get to is teams that are self-motivated and teams that can function by inspiring and motivating each other, as well as looking for that with you.
Chaya, hi, it's Tiziana here.
Hi.
I was just trying to use the Q&A box to feed some thoughts, but I'm not able to do that. So
Don't worry, you can speak. It's nice to hear your voice. Go ahead.
Yes, so first I wanted to signal that the Q&A doesn't work for me, so maybe there is something to fix, but I don't know if that's a common problem. So I will throw my first thoughts with my voice instead. So one of the challenges I find is good communication and keeping the team passionate about what we do in our group. So perhaps these are two of the challenges that I like to bring up right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's often where we look at trying to take the vision that we have in our own head, in our own mind, and see that in another person, see that person be as inspired as we are, as motivated as we are towards the goal. Thank you for the comment here. I feel like I can never fully open up about who I am as a person. It's a really good point to make. As a leader, we're often in the spotlight and people look for what we call authenticity, or being a whole leader, being a real leader, being a human leader. And that doesn't always feel comfortable for us. So I appreciate you sharing here. And maybe there are others who also resonate with this, is, do you sometimes feel like part of you is held back? And there's a really good reason for that. So try to check in with the reasons for that. What is the reason that you might be holding parts of you back? And that may well be serving. I sometimes say we don't need to show everything about ourselves. We can choose to show within our boundaries. Having healthy boundaries about what we show and how we show up can help us to connect with people, in that we are still sharing enough depth, enough of our thinking, enough of our understanding of our values, our purpose, and creating a closeness with people. But it doesn't mean we have to share everything. We still need to hold our boundaries. We have to think about what serves us as a leader when it comes to sharing and authenticity. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to move to a slide where I just want to show some of the elements of what leading your team looks like, what leading people requires from us. So this is what often your team is looking for from you, is creating that space for those shared values. Now you first need to understand what those values are, and maybe that's about creating them together. And when we co-create a set of values, we're much more invested in it. If we're spending time with our team to put a shared set of values together, then we're much more invested than when we are given the corporate values and we're told this is what we should believe in. Positivity and compassion is really important for people to feel that psychological safety. So it is something that as a leader, you really signal the positivity. When things go wrong, how do you lean into that? Do you bring positivity? Do we bring self-compassion? Do we give ourselves a little bit of a hard time? And those teams that really can thrive feel, of course, things go wrong. Of course, there are failures, there are issues along the way, maybe the odd crisis, but where a leader also signals positivity and compassion, a team can also follow suit. Effective communication, of course, because what we often see is that we as a leader have something in our minds, but unless we can effectively communicate that to others, it's as though we never had that thought. If we have a new strategy, we need to effectively communicate that so that people can deliver against that strategy. And where we haven't been able to effectively communicate, it can be frustrating because what is in our mind can't be translated and understood by the people we're trying to communicate with. Trust and respect is, of course, that goes back to that positivity and that compassionate space, but it's also about the credibility and the reliability that we show in that space. Do we show that we are trustworthy and that we respect others as much as we would like respect towards us? So this is very much about the climate that we create where there is trust, mutual trust. And the mutual element is really important. And then, of course, there's what I call the recipe of skills, in that when we build a team, there's very little point in building a team of people who are all the same, and even worse, all the same as us. So it's really about creating a recipe, a blend. If I'm making a dish, it won't be very enjoyable if I have all the same ingredient. I have like just one ingredient or similar ingredients. I need a blend. I need people who complement each other. I need different strengths and weaknesses. But when we have more of these differences, we need to also have a space where people feel included and people can belong. So that brings me to what that thing is that glues people together. And that is your purpose and your values. So just have a little think about how you think about your purpose. Do you know what your purpose is? And if you do, can you articulate that? Do you know what your values are? And your values are your non-negotiables, the things that are core to who you are, what you believe in. And often when we're at the helm of an organization, we are playing a very strong role in putting values together, but the values of your business don't need to be the same as the values of you as a person. But it is important to understand what your values are as a person, in order to know what the business needs to enable it, for you, and how you play that role in signaling what is important. So let me just see. Yeah, connection. So the reason why I asked you to spend a bit of time to think about your purpose, is that the importance of this purpose is the connection that people have to it. So when we think about how people are motivated and what inspires them, it is looking at something that is more than just making money. It's the difference you make. It's the impact you make, the outcomes. And when people can connect to their role in that purpose, then their motivation goes up, then their inspiration and that self-motivation comes from always being connected to what the purpose of the organization is. It's more difficult to be connected to a strategy because a strategy gets real practical. But when your purpose is connected then to the intentions you have for your organization, what it is there to do, and then your intentions connect to your strategy, then your strategy can connect better to your objectives and your goals. And eventually what you really want is that those goals turn into actions. So you can see how people can connect better to your purpose when they see this thread of how your purpose translates all the way through to strategy to action. So I mean, what I think is worth bearing in mind is to think about how connected your purpose is to the things your business actually does and how they actually distill down. And can people see that thread all the way back up? I'll just pause and see if you've got any questions or any comments.
I don't see any questions coming in, so.
Hey, yeah.
One. Okay. I'll read it out for you. So Sergio is asking, are you referring to company's purpose, team purpose, or individual purpose?
The answer is yes, because I think all of these things are important, but they're not disconnected. And where we want to see that that self-motivation, that inspiration to do work aligned with the organization comes from when the individual, and I'm talking about you as a leader, but I'm also talking about the individuals in your team. What are their purposes? Are we getting in touch? Do you know what their purposes are? Do you have conversations about what their purpose is? What brings them to life? What made them join this organization? And what would they like it to what would they like for that organization to be doing, and the purpose that they would like to be seeing in your organization? And that comes when there's a clarity about what your company's purpose is. A team's purpose can fit clearly when that purpose is translating down to, is our purpose connected to the intentions we have in our organizations, our overall goals in our organization? And does that then translate to the strategy we have, which then starts to connect with the objectives we have and the goals? Because then I can see my individual role. Purpose is almost like this red thread that runs through. And what you don't want to see is a break or an offshoot or a thing that is in contradiction to the purpose. If we say one of our purpose is about connecting the community, and then we do things that are disconnecting and separate people or create competition, then that's going to jar. That's where people become a little demotivated. So where are the places that the purpose doesn't add up to them? And maybe there's a narrative, maybe it's about finding a way to help people to understand how it connects to your purpose. Or maybe there is a change or a decision to be made about what actually serves your purpose in your organization and what doesn't. It's a very big space, and it really has to start with the reflection that you have yourself about how your purpose, is your purpose there in your organization? Does it exist in your organization? Is it a language that you use? And to what extent are you aligned? Is your organization aligned with the purpose that you articulate? And of course, I mentioned before the importance of communication, and I think communication skills is one of the most underrated soft skills, and people do it all the time. We communicate all the time, so we think we're kind of good at it, and it also gets muddied with things like presentation skills and charisma and being able to speak well, and it isn't just about how well we speak, it's also about how well we listen. Because successful and effective communication is when your message is actually received and it's understood and it's acted upon with the intention that you had. So how you communicate your vision, your purpose, your strategy should be with clarity, that people are clearer about where to go and what my role is and what our organization does. That there is a vision and that's where purpose comes in. Is it a vision is really creating an aspiration. A purpose actually gives you that that space to kind of hang that vision from, and of course compassion. People want to feel that the organization is about more than just making money. People want to feel that they are looked after, that the society is looked after, that the planet is looked after. And there's more and more of that interest, particularly in the younger generations entering the workforce, is that they're looking to see that accountability and compassion in their leaders, but also in the way in which the organization talks about the direction that it's going in. So I just invite you to do that bit of reflection again at this point and have a think about what is working for you in terms of your communications, and what is not working. What do you see that might be clues that what might be in your mind about a message that you're trying to share in your organization may not be either received or understood or acted upon. And if you feel comfortable to share anything in the Q&A, or you'd like to come off mute, then yeah, please do that. And of course, if you have questions. Okay. So I do invite you to come back to these reflections, particularly if there's things that you're finding difficult to understand, particularly things that aren't going so smoothly. What I encourage you to do is really think about communication as that two-way process. I'm just going to read here. I find clear communication is challenging. Being humans, the process of communicating can still lead to misunderstanding, especially when talking in a language that is not our native tongue. Absolutely. Misunderstandings often come when, of course, we are different people in the first place. On top of that, we all have a different context. We have different upbringings. Yes, language also comes in there, in the way in which we are using words and expressing ourselves is different. So when we put two humans together, of course, there is going to be different. What happens often in communications, I have to say, we tend to be very bad at listening. We think we're very good at it. We tend to not be so good at listening, especially when we've got a lot of other things going on in our mind. So there's ways that we can improve the understanding. And part of it is also just starting with, has the message actually been received? And this is where listening really comes in, is first checking, what did they hear? Asking someone to repeat what they understood helps you to understand where they might be coming from, and then understanding what's the context for them, what's the reason why they came to an understanding that's different to yours, and doing that with a real clean kind of curiosity to just be fascinated about that difference in the way in which things are understood. And then we're in a dialogue, we're in a place where we can see another person's difference, and that's a place of really also appreciating that there is that difference before we try and change it. Only when we really accept that that person has a different view, and that comes from a different context, a different upbringing, a different role that they play, maybe, that we can then start to bridge that. And this is where you really see the importance of dialogue and conversation to kind of address some of that challenge. So another question here from Elisa. I think what really works is the communication that is made in our physical meetings when we have the opportunity to discuss work together. Yeah. And I do think there's a lot we can do online. There is a different sense we get that in real life experiences that we have from people. And it's worth just thinking about why that is. What are we able to pick up in body language? in just that presence with somebody, when somebody is when you share something and it doesn't land well, how well you're able to hear that, absorb that, and feel that with more senses. We're able to tap into many more senses when we're in face-to-face meetings, and particularly when we're in teams, because when we see interactions with each other in a social context, if I have a conversation with somebody which becomes quite emotional, others have the chance to see that emotion and feel that emotion and check in on how they feel. And I don't mean emotion always as a negative. If I'm really passionate about something and I'm having a conversation with another person that's passionate, that emotion, that positive emotion, can also trickle through the whole team. So it's really a good chance to create a culture. Yeah. Another question here. Good point about checking in what was understood. One challenge when working with distributed teams is the feedback loop, understanding how what has been communicated reached the listeners properly. Yeah, we often move on because also we already know what we just shared. And often as a leader, you are having to repeat your message many, many times. And part of that is because it isn't always received. People are busy. So the amount of information that they're filtering through is usually vast. But then on top of that, this mismatch because of the context, because of the type of work we do, actually stopping and doing that checking really helps. And yes, the feedback loop, and what is a feedback loop? It's really listening, and it's conversation and understanding, was what I communicated actually received, actually understood, and understood in the with the intention that I wanted to communicate that. And will they, and do they see clearly what actions are needed as a result? So yes, but so I would really and I really appreciate the questions and the comments here, because this is exactly what I want you to do: spend some time in thinking about communication that you do and whether that actually had the outcome that you were looking for, and if not, having some attention on the way in which you communicate and the richness of the communication that you do, in terms of, like, are we getting a dialogue? Are we actually creating more opportunity to check in with people about the communications? And the other thing I would just say is that sometimes that feels a bit laborious. It feels like it takes a really long time to do that. But think about the amount of time it takes to correct a misunderstanding. So it's really important to just think clearly about, or think carefully about how that effective that communication was before you move on with an assumption that that was understood. From Magdalena, I see. I learned it's important to be transparent and inclusive in a way that things are communicated, even if information may not be directly relevant to the team. Also, active listening is important. Absolutely, Magdalena, you really hit the nail on the head. Yeah. And I think in the June session that I ran, we did spend some time on listening and active listening, and also what pseudo listening is. So I believe you can revisit the recordings. So yeah, have a look at that. So I'm going to move on to really think about the people. And often when we're leading a team, it can be easy to forget that everyone in that team is a completely different individual, and that they have been brought into an organization to do a job, and how they were brought in can change as you go along through that role. And it is all about the connection that we have with ourselves, but also then with others. If you just have a moment to just pause and think about how and why you created the team that you have, and have a think about what your intention was in creating your team, and particularly what that team is achieving for your business. And feel free to come back to that reflection as we go along. Of course, you can share in the Q&A if there's anything that's coming up for you. I wanted to share with you this model. So I work with a number of associates in my team, and one of them is a practitioner for the 6-team condition. So this is one that we often use in teams, just as either as a lens to think about how to build a team and how to keep a team going. But it's also really a bit more of an in-depth way in which you can address some challenges that you might be coming across. There's many models about how teams function, so this is just one, so feel free to also look at some others that might resonate with you. This model came from Dr. Ruth Wagerman and Richard Heckman. They are practitioners at Harvard, but it's also come from a lot of research that happened at Harvard, MIT, Yale, and it was looking at the elements that are absolutely essential in creating highly functioning teams and high performing teams, and some of the things that are real enablers. So you can see these two triangles. On the top triangle, this is the essentials. This is the absolute foundations of having a team in the first place. So first of all, there's a sense of actually having a real team, that everyone knows who's on the team and who isn't. So myself, I have one of these challenges that I have associates. So some of them are more in the team than others. And that also causes a little bit of an issue, because there isn't always clarity about who is actually on the team. It's a container, and when there's a clear boundary around that container, it helps people in exchanging information, in working together, and that real team needs to actually be working together for long enough a time that you are actually accomplishing something meaningful, and that sort of defines it as a real team. Purpose I've talked about already, but the team really needs a compelling purpose. It needs something that challenges them to use the best of the skills that they have, and it connects to their values. And this is where we start to engage the aspirations that they have. And this is what I spoke about earlier, which is about that connection between the purpose and they themselves and the work they want to do. You want people to turn up and do the best work of their lives. And having a compelling purpose can help to channel that. And of course, there's that right people, and this is my kind of recipe of your recipe of people that you put together. The effective team needs to consist of people who have that diversity of knowledge, skills, and also different perspectives, and that those different perspectives can come from different lived experience.
Hello.
Yep.
We're losing you a bit. So.
Oh. Am I back?
I don't know if it was just me, but yeah.
Does anybody else also lose me?
But not for long, but it was just the last 10 seconds or so. So.
Okay, I can. Oh. Tisana can hear well. I'll go over that last one on the right people again. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the right people is all about having an effective team, so that what you're looking for is this recipe, which isn't just people that are all the same. You're looking for that diversity of knowledge, of skills, and of different perspectives. And those perspectives are coming from maybe people with a different lived experience, different backgrounds. So it's important to think about those essential pieces of your team. Then what you see in the triangle below, now these are the enablers. These are the things that really allow for that team to be thriving and doing that best work of their lives. So, and that's starting with having a sound structure. So the team should be as small as possible. When we have excess of people who and this is often happening in an organization if you think about a project that runs on in an organization, the project team itself may not need to have everybody in that organization, but keeping that team lean to the people who absolutely need to be there keeps them focused on their mission and the priorities, and it also helps them to collaborate better within a tighter knit group of people. When teams become bigger and so big that they can't function, we lose that collaboration, we lose that focus on priorities. And as a person in that team, it's easy to be lost yourself in terms of how you function and what the importance of your role there. The supportive context is really important. So this is really all the systems around the team. So things like, how are they rewarded? Do they get training? Is there resources there? And how do they work together as a team? Everything in their context should enable them to work as a team. Sometimes you see, for example, the reward system is rewarding individual performance, and it can create competition in an organization. So does that serve teamwork? Probably not. So are there systems in place that actually support the way in which you need people to be working? And then, of course, there's expert team coaching. And this is that the team has somewhere to go for help, that there's someone or people who have the experience and the ability to support that team. Where is that support coming from? Maybe there's a board that supports that team. Maybe there's a coach themselves, and often some of the work that I do is doing that exactly, to be there to help calibrate the team, check from the outside. There are often people who are on the outside, but also really invested in that team's success, and it helps them to think about their practices and how they can keep on track. So yeah, it's kind of it can seem quite a lot when you look at this model. It's worth just checking in with the essentials and seeing, where are there gaps? Where do you see that you need to focus your attention? And when you have that foundation, then having a think about how the other elements like the structure and the supportive context and that team coaching, what for you is there and is one of your strengths, and what do you see as the areas of focus for you as a team? Are there any comments and questions on this? What came up for you when you were here listening to this model? Any aha moments? Sometimes the team disagrees. How do you manage that? Yeah, very important to be able to have a climate where disagreement can be aired. So what we don't want is that people don't feel comfortable to express disagreement that they have. What you need is the ability to do that in a constructive way. So when we're able to show different opinions, to show different ideas and disagree with somebody, and if we're able to communicate that in a really effective way, one of the methodologies I use and I train on is nonviolent communication, and that's really being able to separate out what is observable facts, what is the emotion and the element that where I experience something, and how can we express that in a way that helps people to keep some empathy within the team and respect for each other, and be able to make really clear requests as to what they need and want. What we often see is that people skip some of those elements of really connecting with each other, and the disagreement then spills over into conflict. So getting really good at communicating with each other, and I'll come to this a little bit later, which is having really good systems of feedback that are ongoing, that are just part of the way in which your team functions, there will of course be disagreement, and we do want that, because the last thing you want is that if somebody disagrees and they actually have a really good idea, that they don't feel psychologically safe to bring it up, because the climate, whether that's the skills that we have in the team to actually communicate disagreement, make it difficult to express, or it becomes even to a point of being toxic, where disagreement is shut down and discouraged. So, and often just think about your own role as a leader is actually, if you want a team where everybody says yes and doesn't disagree, then we may be falling into a trap of being you having hired people who have different ideas and perspectives, and then not taking those perspectives on board. So as a leader, we also need to be able to hear and listen to disagreement, and be open to that. But yeah, I think we definitely need to work on our skills to be able to do that. Thank you for that question. Yeah, and I wanted to bring in this point about what we talk about diversity, and a lot of these words, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think this is just a moment to just pause and check in on your own bias. Is there diversity in how you hire? And beyond that diversity in how you hire, is there inclusion in how you create a culture? If you look at what these actually mean, the diversity is really referring to all of these difference in demographics. So ethnicity, gender, age, location, nationality, all of these factors. But it's how you foster that difference. And that comes to these elements of equity and inclusion. And equity is really giving people a fair and equal access to opportunities, regardless of what their diversity of their background is. What we can sometimes see is that breaks down in organizations where they see, for example, if a new hire has a disability, is there an equality in the experience that person can have in terms of the resources that they can access? And some of those disabilities can be invisible. So it's really important to check in on elements like neurodiversities. What are the ways in which we see people, and look for equity or opportunities for equity? A lot of that will come in having open conversations about what people need and want. So keeping the topic of equity within that conversation is really important. Inclusion is really important, and inclusion and belonging are really places where when people feel really demotivated, this is a place to look, is that to what extent do they feel included? Inclusion is really about how employees are interacting in an organization. When they have an idea, how well is that idea received? Are the colleagues around them and yourself as a leader, is that uplifting that person? What happens when we're in feedback conversations? Is there constructive feedback that helps people to feel included? And belonging is centering on the experience that the person is feeling. Is that sense of being valued and needed and wanted? And belonging comes from that person, the individual themselves, and how they come to an organization and feel a sense of belonging. It's like an alignment between who I am and where I am. Just looking at a question here. So with regards to MVC, so nonviolent communications and good communication, it's challenging to make a change. A training normally gives the knowledge, but when people get triggered, react based on their patterns. Do you have advice on how to drive change in a more useful communication style, and also how to create a safe space to give feedback? Practice is my answer, really. When I do nonviolent communication training, we practice as much as possible, and we need to revisit. We're never done in one training. So I just did a session in June with an organization, and on a monthly basis, we're putting together practice sessions. And these are places for them to keep trying and testing the language you use. So something like nonviolent communication gives you very helpful language that is a shared common language within that team that you understand. And I don't know, I can of course do a whole workshop on nonviolent communication, but what they have is like personas of a jackal, which is the more violent communication, and a giraffe, which is the non-violent communication. And I saw this team beautifully saying, that sounds a bit jackal to me. Can you say it in a bit more of a giraffe way? So you can see that the interactions that they're having, they're actually practicing it, but they're using it on a daily basis. And that goes with any soft skills training. We can do all of the training, but unless it's practiced, it's just a nice way to spend 2 hours or 2 days in this case. So yeah, it's and soft skills, like any other skill, you have to be using them to for it to be effective. Just the last thing I wanted to share, just on culture, particularly around this around inclusion, is that it's really important to spend time to be really intentional. Your culture is building whether you are paying attention to it or not. So we often have accidental cultures, and because they are invisible, it's really difficult to pick up on those pain points and challenges along the way. When there is a culture, it's also the thing that's just not discussed and not talked about. So some of the most harmful cultures that we have just evolved from a competitive environment, from high pressure to deliver on a project, from things that went wrong in the past. And often the culture has been created by the things we reacted to. So what I invite you to do is spend some time to research and study with like absolute fascination, to explore what is that culture that exists in your organization, the one that happens without you even being conscious of it, and how can you pay more attention to that culture. Look at the clues that might be, for example, if you're finding competition between people in a team, where's this culture of competition? Is it a culture of competition in the team? Where does it come from? And also, what are the things that is keeping that culture alive, that is keeping things going and putting fuel on that fire, really? So I'm just going to pause and see if you've got any comments and questions. That's quite a heavy bit that I've just been through.
Because I'm a panelist, I can't type a Q&A, which is weird. So maybe based on this, the question I would probably phrase for you is, if there is an accidental harmful culture, how do you work towards improving it then? So what are some ideas for that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to start talking about it and start listening to people's experiences. So that's always a place to start, is through dialogue, or always start from this place of like active listening, deep listening. When we have that chance to see the things that are accidental, because they've happened from a responsive space, a reactive space, we need to take that moment to just think and respond with a bit more time. So just spending time to look at all the other systems in place that made that accidental purpose come to life. And there may be some things like a competitive environment and like an externally influencing. So if you're in a competitive industry, how is that actually impacting your organization? And it's so often that we lend that competitive, we borrow that competitive culture and we bring it into our organization. And we have a choice, because we can still have high performance without people competing against each other. We can be competing towards a common goal. But a lot of that is going to come through the conversation dialogue that we start with, looking at all the systems and how they play together, how we play a role in that, and then looking at ourselves. And that means starting with us as a leader, the role that we are playing, we're signaling, we're the strongest signal in the room. We're the strongest role model for the kind of culture that we want to create. And so we may often be playing a role in that. And many times I've spoke to leaders who just didn't even realize the role that they are playing in that culture. So having a space to think about that. And feedback cultures are really important to pay attention to, is how can people give and receive feedback to each other. That's something that I will also come back to a little bit as well, is do we have the space to actually be able to say what's there? And that a lot of that is about bringing what's invisible to become more visible, and only when you can see it, measure it, understand it, can you actually try and change it. And think about what you need to really change. And if you think about, I go back to some of the things that people even basically are the basics of what people need in a team, is your culture in contradiction to trust and respect, positivity and compassion, effective communication, the shared values? Is it in conflict with some of these elements that we spoke about? And that might be worth paying more attention to. Okay, so I'm going to move to this bit, which is really about this run and maintain. It's very much about how when we're putting a team together, when we're hiring, we're really much more intentional space of being conscious about what we're bringing in, how we're building at the beginning, and onboarding, whatever those things are. But when we get into the flow of work, and maybe we're 6 months down the line, a year down the line, 5 years down the line, we may end up taking our eye off the ball. And the level of engagement that people have, and of course, like, you can do an engagement survey, you can do all of these things to find out how engaged your staff are, how motivated they are. But paying attention to the impact that is having on the organization is worth a worthy exercise, because in understanding the cost of that engagement, then we really think more seriously about the way in which we act in our organizations to improve that. If you think about, and I have this rowing boat kind of example, but if you think that you've got 10 people on a boat, for example, probably not 10 people on that boat, but if you've got 10% who are disengaged in your organization, or just not very engaged, that's a little bit less power going into the direction that your organization is moving towards. And not only are you looking at people who are just not in that sweet spot of highly engaged, but you may even have people who are actively disengaged. And actively disengaged, there was a study quite a few years ago. I think the levels of engagement in organizations have actually gone down through the years, but it showed that around a third of staff are not engaged, or 2/3 are engaged or highly engaged. But that leaves a third that are not engaged. So it's kind of like people just sitting on the boat, but they're not rowing. Then you have often there are organizations where you might have 10% who are actively disengaged. These are people who are like rowing in the other direction. They're actually almost trying to stop you from achieving your goals. And when those things are invisible and we're not managing those, then we can tip into a space where teams become dysfunctional, and that engagement is tipping over into maybe a little bit what we're asking about with disagreements, and where the disagreement tips over into conflicts. And particularly, conflicts and disagreements in teams are like smelly fishes. Like, the longer you leave it, the worse it's going to get. So it's really worth addressing some of the dysfunctions that go on in your team, and doing that together, and doing it well. Oh, thanks for sharing the link to the last recording. Yeah, I wanted to offer you another model. this is based on a book that I really recommend you reading if you are leading a team where you're wondering about how well they function. And this is a book by Patrick Lencioni, and he's talking about this. What he talks about is 5 dysfunctions of a team. He tells it through a really nice story of a team and how they come across each of these elements. What he explains is that these are the foundations of how a well-functioning team, all the elements that we need in a well-functioning team. And when things go wrong, these are the places that hurt the team the most. And so that foundation at the bottom of this triangle is when there is an absence of trust. And this is sometimes seen in this fear of being vulnerable, and a fear of really showing ourselves. That trust comes over time, and is built over time. And so when there is an absence of that trust and it continues over time, it can be really destructive to a team. Fear of conflict is one to just pay attention to, because and this is where that feedback conversation comes up again, is that when we are able to have conversations in constructive language that help to address conflict and bring it back to healthy disagreements and healthy dialogue, then we're able to overcome that fear. Often the fear of the conflict is the thing that's the dysfunction in the team, not the conflict itself. I see a question from Magdalena. How about a culture where the majority of people is over-engaged and the constant drive to outperform ourselves and exceed our goals sometimes leads to a high-pressure environment where expectations are sky high? Yeah, it sounds like it's actually the engagement is tipped over into yeah, and it is about the previous slide. I'll go back to that slide, that's fine. Oh, it's not very much on that slide, so there we go. Yeah, what you're talking about is a competition, the competitiveness that seems to have come from the over-engagement. What I would ask is, what are they engaged? What is the direction towards which they are engaged? Is it the purpose of your organization, or is it something else? Is there something that they're trying, that often there's a great kind of description in nonviolent communication that conflicts, disagreements, these sort of high pressure things, they're often an expression of an unmet need. What is the unmet need in the culture where people are competing, probably maybe, high pressure environment, maybe even to the detriment of their own health or mental health, and that drive to outperform each other might be a signal about what other systems might be at play. If I think of this model here, whether there's a supportive context, whether there's team coaching, it is the compelling purpose the one that is fostering the right behaviors, and is it engaging their aspirations in a way that's healthy? Now it feels like they may have actually tipped over into a slightly unhealthy way. So I would, Magdalena, maybe look at the supportive context piece to begin with, and then see where other elements of the team conditions might be at play. So it's not about internal competition, but office culture where people are motivated, but I see the risk of exhaustion and burnout. Yeah, and this is where I mean where it becomes unhealthy, and it takes its toll on people's mental health. So the supportive context can also be around creating a new culture where we look out for each other, where we're checking when people are spending too much time at work, when actually that push and that motivation is preventing people from just looking out for each other, that looking for connection again. It may be that coming back to that team coaching space is actually having some support that helps you to just stop and take note and maybe even set out some rules about how we look after each other. How do we keep the team healthy? As for you as a leader, because I can understand that responsibility on your shoulders can be significant, but also then fostering that within the team. How do they look out for each other? Because often they are working with each other in a more intimate way than we work with them. And when you're the boss, you get different information to what they see themselves. And creating places where not only people look out for each other, but people feel free to raise their hand and say, I'm a bit over my optimal kind of working environment and need help. And it might be worth looking at the structures and the context there, that what are the consequences that people feel there might be for asking for help, for stepping back, for taking it down a notch. So I hope that helps. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to this model. So as I just mentioned about conflict, it's the fear of the conflict that actually causes a dysfunction here. So really having a think about the way in which communication, but also those places when we disagree, that we can do that in a constructive way. Lack of commitment, and that's sometimes the lack of clarity, or even buy-in to what there is. I mean, for example, if there's a change in the organization, is there a lack of understanding about what that change is? Or is there actually a lack of buy-in? And I don't really believe in it. And this is a foundation that can break, particularly when making decisions and sticking to those decisions, is that when there's a lack of commitment towards that, it can become dysfunctional. Avoidance of accountability is a really important one. This is, blame culture, or places where, and then it's a need to avoid this kind of discomfort that happens when we hold each other to account. So when we behave in ways that might not be aligned with the corporate values or the what we need to perform, is that we need to be able to hold ourselves accountable and be held accountable. But when we avoid that, not only does it cause that issue within that element, but it also shows people that it's okay to avoid accountability. There is a trickle effect. And then, of course, inattention to results, and that is really just missing the big picture elements of core, like performance, work towards the strategy, focus on customers. That some of those elements that are absolutely essential, because you are a business and you are an organization that needs results. And when we are overwhelmed with all the other elements in our jobs, and we pay less attention to the results, it can become a dysfunction that shows up. Yeah, so I think it's just worth taking a moment to think about where you see, and dysfunction is a big word. Sometimes there are small clues to where things aren't quite functioning to its optimal level. Paying attention to some of those things that are lower on those, the foundations, they're the ones that without trust, pretty much everything else starts to fall away. That where are the things that you see are areas of focus for you? So you can take your pen and paper, or how you want to reflect, have a think about that, and maybe think about one or two things that you can do to pay a little bit more attention to those. And of course, if you've got any questions, please do add. How do you avoid lack of commitment? Lack of commitment is one that can often hide in plain sight. If someone is literally showing up, I guess this is what people would call quiet quitting. And that's what I mean. It can kind of just be hidden somewhere. That I think avoiding it. I think more important than avoiding it is actually addressing it when you've got a new change coming up in an organization, or you've got a change in direction, whatever the thing is that you want commitment on. Spending time in dialogue to understand, I mean, and knowing that there is a risk of lack of commitment, creating space for more clarity, creating space for dialogue to get conversation and buy-in, to understand what might be getting in, what might cause the lack of commitment. And it's different in every organization. So taking the time to, when decisions are made, get into dialogue, check in, where is their commitment, where is there lack of commitment, where do we need to pay more attention, and just starting from that space of conversation and listening really well. The question from Sergio about the 5 dysfunctions: how is the evaluation of the current status best done? By observing behaviors, dedicated to meeting. I think some of the best places to do this is to start with a conversation in a team. Actually start to look at, and of course there are diagnostics and ways that you can actually, especially in larger teams, have a check as to how the team is actually doing on these elements. But some of the simplest ways you can do is just start to have a conversation in your team, and look for evidence. So this is a framework about some of the dysfunctions. So where are you seeing evidence for a fear of conflict or avoiding accountability? Each of these are adding up. It's like these buckets that drip by drip can be filling up with elements that can be moving you to a place of dysfunction. And just like a bucket then overflows when we've not paid attention to it, it's really about picking up on those and calling those out. The dysfunctions are invisible until we're paying attention to them. So really starting with the openness to have a conversation about where we might have dysfunctions, and then taking actions. And maybe some of that is upskilling. Maybe some of that is about spending time with the team, and seeing what they experience. And I think a lot of the dysfunctions exist when we think it's going to go away, when we think we just need everybody to just work harder, faster, longer, whatever the thing is, and then that will fix everything. But particularly those that are lower on that, in that base of the triangle, are the ones that are going to disrupt the rest of the functions of the team. Yeah. And of course, if you need more help and support on this, feel free to reach out, because this is hard work, and it's particularly hard to do when you're in the flow of how you work as a team, and taking a moment to kind of check in, reset, recalibrate, and think about where you go next is often something that's helpful to do with another person, particularly that kind of team coaching, an external person that helps you. Okay. So I just want to come back to that element of feedback, and we've spoken about it. This is a model that I showed actually in the last training that I ran. So Smithesh has put in the link to that, so you can go back, and I won't go over the whole thing again. But feedback has come up many, many times, and feedback culture is really important to establish. It is the core of like how you're able to communicate with each other really effectively. So this is a model from Kim Scott, which is called Radical Candor. And what she is explaining is that in high-performing teams, feedback is really valuable. And it helps when you are giving feedback in a way that is direct, that actually directly challenges, particularly when it is within a team. It's important to set up this sort of cultures where this is the way in which we can challenge, and that it is direct. The opposite of that is either being indirect or being a little, or just not saying anything at all. But that it also needs to be balanced with actually caring personally, that we need to have some real empathy and compassion, and I really care about that person. And that is why we are directly challenging them and holding them to account. It's coming back to some of those things in that triangle of dysfunctions. And each of these elements, she shows that actually, if you were to care personally, but not speak out, this is sort of where maybe you don't want to upset the person, or you don't want them to feel bad, but that turns into this ruinous empathy, which is kind of an over caring. But if you care so much that you are avoiding that conflict and avoiding addressing the situation. Of course, if you're very direct, but you're not caring personally, she calls it obnoxious aggression, but it is this place where the impact of that direct challenge is not taken into account, and it's not coming from a place that cares about the other person. There's often their own motives, and that comes across as this obnoxious aggression. And of course, there's a place where you're not direct, and you may not even give them feedback at all, and that comes across as this insincerity, and it's quite strongly called it manipulative insincerity. So she calls it radical candor, which is a place where there's a humility and that care personally, and your goal is a shared goal, that you actually want to move in the same direction. You're being helpful, you're doing this for the right reasons. It needs to be that feedback's given in the moment or shortly afterwards. It's sometimes not appropriate to give it right in that moment, but these are the cultures of feedback that build when we're able to use the language that we have, that we know is direct and caring, and be able to give that to the person in the moment, and wherever possible in person. So of course, we do a lot of things online, but wherever we're able to make that as personal as possible, it can be more effective. Being specific, being sincere, and it's important to make sure that it's not personal. It's not about personalities. It's not you're always like that. That's just because you are lazy, tired, whatever the thing is. Being able to create spaces where we see the behaviors as separate from the person, and appreciation of the person as a whole. And of course, as a leader, you model it, and you set the tone about how we give and receive feedback in an organization. So model it, and when you see good feedback, celebrate it and create that culture from positively rewarding the kind of feedback that you want to see in the organization. So I've been through a lot. I want you to just spend a little bit of time to just have a think about, from what I've been sharing with you today, where do you think you need and want to develop? Where do you see that you could need to pay attention to? And when you can see some specific things and actions that you can take, what specific actions would you take to develop some of those skills? I'll give you a moment. In particular, just thinking about your actions, maybe you can think about something that you can even do tomorrow. I think I have got some time for Q&A. I just want to share with you my email address in case there's anything you've got questions about that I've been through. Maybe it's brought up some ideas. If there's things that you would like to work with me on more, or any of my associates, we do quite a lot of work with teams and cultures. We do trainings and one-on-one coachings as well. So feel free to get in touch. I'm really happy to help if there's anything that I can support you in. So any last questions, or if you want to raise your hand or ask a question.
Yeah, you can also raise a hand and I'll help you unmute yourself. So if you want to talk with Chaya or say something about Chaya or the session we've just had, if anybody is interested. Tiziana.
Hi, Chaya. It's
Hey.
Tiziana here again. I have
Hi.
a question which connects to points of your webinar. The initial part where you suggested the importance of a leadership which is supported by empathy, by compassion, and also the importance of very clear candor and clear communication, but also direct communication in case of issues in the team or individual members of the team. I agree, and I see where these recommendations come from. In practice, it's hard to find the right approach which combines the two. As you say, caring for people sometimes brings you to being less explicit about the problems, and finding the right way to address them becomes more complicated in practice.
Yeah, it does. And this is often where I say, just reach out and get help in doing that. There's a study that's happened where, and of course I'm rubbish with the reference of this, but there's a study that looked at whether teams could self-manage cultures that, and particularly when there isn't good communication. And actually found that just having a person who's coming in from the outside, this is what I mean, like, is there someone in the board? Is there someone like, of course, you welcome to hire someone like a coach like myself or a consultant. But when a third party comes in and supports and coaches and helps a team through their evolution, they are more able to accept change. Because often when we try and do it ourselves, we are in the system, we are in the culture, we're already in, like, this is the norm. So breaking out from that norm is harder when we don't have a person that helps to shift our thinking a little bit. There are places that you can, for example, you could do an online training as a whole team. But I have seen teams do this, and it takes commitment to practice it and to keep coming back to dialogue and conversation together. So when I did my nonviolent communication training, there was a whole team who were going through it together. So they did the training as an intact team, and they spent their practice time together, and that started to shift their culture and the way in which they communicated with each other. And because they had that time to have an agreed norm of how we go ahead and understand why it's important, it helped them to make that change in a more effective way. So there are ways that you can help this process, but indeed it is a really difficult thing to do, because often this is learned behaviors that we have learned. Not only as I said, we tend to be really rubbish at listening. We tend to be having a lot of thoughts in our own minds while another person's talking, and And so, yeah, it is something that takes a bit of unlearning for us to be able to learn. We have to almost take some time out and take some space to do that. So.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. But as soon as I say that, there is something.
Magdalena, I genuinely care about the team members, and I want to ensure that our interactions are positive. As a result, I'm cautious about even constructive criticism. However, I've realized that this cautious approach can sometimes prolong the time it takes to address the issues effectively. What's the ideal approach in that sense? Yeah, there's a reason why we say to give the feedback as in the moment or as close to the moment as possible. If you think about a stressful situation, and we get a cortisol rush in stress. So this is like a stress hormone. We get a bunch of other hormones as well. But that has a longevity of about 45 minutes. So if we are addressing conflict within that time or disagreement within that time, we're able to bring people out of that cortisol rush, that stressful moment, and that's the space for that empathy. And starting from that place of understanding how to give good feedback. Most of the time in organizations, and I say 13 years in a very corporate career, I've seen very few people able to give really good feedback. So that doing that upskilling and then being able to give that feedback in the moment is really important. And yeah, the word criticism is really sometimes can be triggering for people. Even have you ever had that feeling when somebody says to you, do you mind, can I have a word? I just want to give you some feedback. What happens in your body? What's happening in your experience then? And if you imagine then how well they can hear the feedback. So a lot of that learning how to give feedback, a big part of it is also learning how to receive feedback, is to create that space and those cultures and doing that together as a team to understand what the importance of feedback and how to do it. But one really easy step is to start to share maybe some articles on giving and receiving feedback, and sharing it with your team and saying, I'd like to think about how we give and receive feedback to each other. Shall we discuss this in our next team meeting? And just starting from that place of even just seeing how do people feel about feedback, and particularly words like criticism and constructive criticism. Yeah, we've come out of the world doesn't help us with this. We come out of an academic, out of our education, our academic world, where we need to do constructive criticism as part of how we are a good academic. So when we translate that to the world of work, we think it's going to work the same, but it doesn't. It doesn't. So yeah, we have to unlearn some of that too. Thank you for that question.
Okay. Now I'm going to say it, but maybe somebody proves me wrong again. I do not see any other questions. In which case, I will like to thank all of you for joining the session. It has been a very interactive and lively session. So thank you for joining in the discussion. And I would also like to thank you, Chaya, for this interesting and very useful webinar, quite full of information and knowledge for all of us to consider and reflect upon. Let me see. Oh yeah, there's just somebody saying, Tiziana saying thanks to you.
Thank you.
The recording will be available on the US DIH website in the coming days. So as soon as the Zoom converts it and makes it available for us to update it. So in case you want to go back and listen to some of the other aspects of the presentation, then feel free to do that. And thank you for coming to the webinar. Have a nice day.
Take care.